Butlu and others, we established the Thabo Mbeki Foundation. And the reason we did that was exactly to address the matters that Reverend Molo has raised. To say that we needed perhaps an instrument which would help us to help Africa to realize their dreams and indeed these opportunities for development, for developing their future. And in that context, we decided that really basically what we needed to do was to see in what ways we could assist with regard to the implementation of policy positions that have been taken by the Organization of African Unity and after it the African Union. Positions that they've taken these two organizations to say this is where Africa should be. This is where Africa should be going. And therefore these are policies indeed, Reverend Molo, which do represent Africa's dreams and Africa's values, and pointing a way forward towards developing this better future for herself that she needs. I'm sure that many of us present here know this, that in many instances you have a somewhat negative press assessment of these two organizations, the OAU and followed by the AU. But what nobody can gainsay is that these two organizations have in fact done very important work with regard to elaborating the policies which a continent needs in order to achieve its renaissance. I think part of what has driven this process is a proper assessment by ourselves as Africans of what has gone wrong in the past. And as you know, many things did go wrong. I'm talking about the years after the independence of many of our countries, where you had experience of military coups and therefore military governments, where you had an economy that was declining. Professor Mbutlu has just spoken quite correctly about what's happening now to the African economies. But then this was the past when those economies declined and poverty got even further entrenched on our continent. The continent which saw lots and lots of conflicts, some of which, as Reverend Molo indicated earlier during our prayers, some of which are still continuing. But I'm saying that this drive to elaborate these policies was informed by this experience when the continent said, enough is enough. We've made too many mistakes, too many things have gone wrong, and therefore things must change. The consequence of all that is that the continent does indeed have a whole basket of policies which deal with all of the major challenges that the continent faces. Whether it is the challenges of the politics of our continent, what to do in order to establish democratic systems, what to do in order to achieve peace, what to do in order to eradicate poverty and underdevelopment, what to do about the empowerment of women, the rights of the child, education, agricultural development, all of this. So there's a body of policy which happily has been agreed by the continent as a whole. And therefore the challenge becomes not the elaboration of new policies, but the challenge becomes what do we do to ensure that these policies are transformed into reality. And really basically this is the challenge we face, and it's a difficult one. A few weeks ago, I was reading a report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Sierra Leone. They established their own Truth and Reconciliation Commission after the end of the civil war in that country. And it tells a story which I think conveys a particular message to ourselves as Africans. And they say that part of what led to the civil war in Sierra Leone was a particular practice, a practice of a particular kind of politics. That you had two major political parties in Sierra Leone, calling themselves national parties, but in fact they were regional parties. One party represented one region of the country and the other region of the party. And of course, as you would understand in the context of African reality, that also meant that they represented different tribes. One consequence of that was that whenever each of these parties took power, they made sure that they would then exclude and persecute the losing party. And so you'd have an instance where one party wins and then institutes criminal proceedings against the losing party. Completely cooked up, but gets people tied up in the courts for a long time, answering charges which are in fact false. But that was to disempower the party so that come the next elections, it's not strong enough to contest. And then you'd see the same thing happening with regards to distribution of resources. That resources would then be distributed according to this pattern, with the winning party making sure that its supporters get these benefits and the losers are denied that. In reality, what they were doing was to destroy any sense of common nationhood. I suspect, Reverend Moro, that we even as South Africans need to learn something from that lesson. Because I see very worrying trends even here at home of a reversion to tribalism, of people talking about being this or that or the other tribe. I'm saying that in Sierra Leone, in the end, that led to a very destructive war. But it's intimately connected, I was saying, to this matter about what Africa wants to do about her future, what is her dream about her own future. And that dream is about establishing strong democratic systems, and therefore responding to the sorts of challenges. Challenge that resulted in the killings in Kenya 5 years ago. As a result of those elections, again, it was about the same concerns, same issues, as had already in Sierra Leone. But these are matters that we need to address and therefore have to answer the question, what is it that practically needs to be done to ensure that these excellent policies of the African Union, for instance about the matter of democracy, that these policies are in fact implemented. The continent, indeed again, as Reverend Molo said during the prayers, indeed the continent has great need for peace. To end the conflict in Somalia, in the Eastern Congo, to deal with this relatively new challenge, the emergence of jihadist groups like Al-Shabaab, like Boko Haram. To answer the question practically, what do we do about this? Because it may very well be that these groups will spread, will emerge everywhere. Even as we're talking, we want peace on the continent. We have people like this who do not hesitate, as they didn't hesitate in Kenya and in Nairobi recently, to kill innocent people. I think it requires, all of this, requires very detailed attention. These are challenges which cannot be solved merely by resort to principle. When I've spoken to our Nigerian friends, for instance, about Boko Haram, they say to me that Boko Haram is not a new phenomenon, that it actually started in the 1950s. And it was a rejection, in fact, of British colonialism. That some people among the Muslim north of Nigeria felt that British colonialism was destroying their culture, destroying their values, creating a sense of lack of cohesion among the people. And therefore that it had to end. Lots of things happened then. There was one incident when the predecessor of Boko Haram killed a British official, colonial official. And the British colonial authorities responded with a lot of force and destroyed 2 villages which they said were sympathetic to the then Boko Haram. The founder of that movement was killed. And his son, as a very young boy, was brought up by an uncle. Many decades later, that young boy, grown into an old man, was the one who restarted Boko Haram. With that memory, and they would say that now, that whereas the British then destroyed our villages, the Nigerian government now is destroying our villages. They respond like that. So I'm saying, to deal with this matter, one has to get into the detail of it. Yes, the vision is there. Yes, the dreams are there. Yes, the values are there. But practically, what is it that we do? To transform those dreams and policies into reality. We can say the same thing about the economy. Again, as Professor Nkuzu said, it's quite correct that clearly the continent has turned the corner with regard to these matters of economic growth and so on. But I don't know, Professor Nkuzu, if you've done this research. I haven't. But I'm absolutely certain that that growth which we see, Africa is growing at 6%, 7%, 8%, whatever, is not translating into the reduction of poverty among the ordinary people. The statistics look good, and indeed are good. But what impact are they having in terms of changing the quality of life of people? And that becomes an issue. So that's what I'm saying again. We need to, in order to realize this African dream and to make sure that we take advantage of this opportunity to develop our future, we need to go below policy into the actuality, the practicals of what needs to be done. 2 years ago, the African finance ministers decided that there should be established a panel to deal with the matter of illicit capital flows out of Africa. This is the illegal export of capital from the continent. And so they asked me to chair this panel. So we started doing this work to try and assess this issue. How big a problem is it? How does it manifest itself? What do we do about it? And we're hoping that we'll be able to submit our report to the African Union, the African finance ministers in the first place, maybe by March next year. And as we've looked at this matter, you can see what the problems are. First of all, let me say that the estimates are that the continent is losing something in the order of $50 billion a year of money that is taken out of the continent illegally. Now measure that against what we receive, the continent receives as development assistance, as aid. The continent annually gets half of that. So 25 billion comes into the continent as aid, and 50 billion leaves as illicit capital outflows. And as we've looked at this matter, it's very interesting to see what happens. You get, for instance, Thabo Mbeki forms a company and says, I'm going to invest in country X. And the country X says, all right, we are very good, thank you very much for coming to invest, and we'll give you a tax holiday for 5 years. So for 5 years, we don't pay any taxes. Now 1 month before the tax holiday period runs out, I sell business to Zwangilamura. He really is my friend. He re-registers his company under a new name. He's a new investor, so he gets 5 more years of tax holiday. We've seen instances, come across instances where we ask countries that, for instance, are exporting oil, producing and exporting oil, to ask them this very simple question: do you know how much oil you are exporting, producing and exporting? And they say, we don't. We're entirely dependent on what the companies report. I'm saying these are some of the ways by which capital is exported illegally. Or you might get an instance where here's a country which produces a number of minerals. And what the mining companies will do is to take an ingot, make it an alloy. So you put in this ingot platinum and any other material, the cheaper metal metals, lead, tin, or whatever. This ingot is 95% platinum. But when it is declared to customs, it's declared as a tin ingot. Now, as African countries, we don't have this capacity to look at this ingot to see how it is made up. You'd only be able to tell what actually is in it in the smelters in Europe. When they smelt it and then separate this, then now you can see. So what happens is that platinum, which is 1,000 times more expensive than tin or lead, that money stays out there. And what comes back is the money for the sale of tin or lead or whatever. I'm mentioning this to say that, again, when we address this matter about this dream of an Africa's economy that develops, as a consequence of which we deal with these challenges of poverty and underdevelopment, to deal with that matter, again, we've got to come down to the practical things that need to be done. The statement of the vision, of the dream, of the values by itself is not going to bring us the change that we need. And so what do we need? We need people who are change agents. Really, my own dream is that all of us, even here at this Bethesda Methodist mission present today, should see ourselves as those change agents. To say if there's a challenge of peace, I shouldn't delegate the responsibility to bring about that peace to somebody else. But I should ask myself the question, what is it that I can do to help to bring about that peace? And I'm quite certain that that's also the attitude that we need to take with regard to the challenges our own country faces. We can see what is going wrong. I was saying, for instance, I'm sure all of us need to be very concerned about a regression to tribalism. And it's very sad and tragic that we just celebrated the centenary of the ANC last year. And at its very foundation, these founding fathers and mothers said its purpose was to bury the demon of tribalism. And 100 years later, this demon is raising its head. And you see stickers on cars, 100% value. I'm told there's another one which says 110% Tswana. What do we do to respond to that? I'm saying that all of us need to see ourselves as change agents, to say, here is something that's going on. Not to say, no, somebody else is going to address it, somebody else is going to do it, but to say, what do I do about it? So we thought that therefore one of the things that we needed to do was to indeed to try and build and cultivate these change agents and establish together with the University of South Africa, with UNISA, an African Leadership Institute. And we decided to work on this thing with UNISA because, as you know, UNISA has got, as a distance learning institution, it's got a very big footprint on the African continent. Got many, many students from many African countries. And we thought if we establish this leadership institute with them, then we'll be able to access students from across the continent, which in fact is happening. And I think one of the things that's very exciting about it is the excitement of the young people who come into the program, who finish these short courses they're doing, very inspired to do something to change the continent for the better. And I really think that this is our collective task, as I was saying, our collective task to be change agents. As Professor Kuzu was saying earlier, there was a time when the rest of the world had an agenda about Africa, which agenda had originated from within our continent. And indeed, as he was saying, when we engaged people like President Bush and Prime Minister Blair and so on, we said to them that really the time had passed that they decide for us what our future should be. That it was, if they wanted a partnership with us as Africans, that partnership had to be based on their acceptance of the policies, the visions, the dreams, the programs that we as Africans had developed ourselves. And they agreed. But I dare say that that moment seems to have passed. We saw a dramatic representation of that, of course, with regard to the matter of Libya. Because when those demonstrations started in Libya, calling for a change of government and so on, the African Union did intervene, engaged the late Colonel Gaddafi and his government, and said to them that it was important that Libya should transform itself into a democracy. That in order to do that, it would be important for the government of Libya to engage with the rebellion so that together they then decide what to do about Libya. And therefore that there was no need to resolve that particular conflict in Libya by resort to force. So the African Union took a decision about this matter, passed a formal resolution, set up a team of heads of state who had to make sure that that program was implemented, including our president here. And then they conveyed that message to the UN Security Council. And the UN Security Council proceeded to completely ignore what the African Union had said about a very important member state of the African Union, an African country. They ignored that and decided that they were going to use force to solve this problem of Libya. The continent told them then that that intervention was going to produce very negative results for Libya and for the rest of the continent. But because they had lost this respect for African Union, they decided to ignore all of those warnings. Today, Libya is virtually a failed state. Tribal groups fighting one another. A government that is dysfunctional. And it spilled over, you saw this thing spilling over into Mali, which resulted in the virtual collapse of the state of Mali. Somebody was telling me last week that these jihadists in northern Mali who were then driven out of Mali, in fact, have occupied southern Libya and are able to cover a distance of 2,000 kilometers in 2 days to carry out operations right around the Sahel. But that's one of the consequences of the Western intervention in Libya. They've now left. They bombed, Gaddafi was killed, and they've left. and left us with the problem. I'm saying that this is part of what we have to address as these change agents. What is it that we do in order to restore to her place, Africa to her place in the ordering of international affairs, so that we reassert our right and our duty as Africans to determine our own destiny. I don't know, there might be people in the hall here who are Zimbabwean, who might be supporting one party or the other. Please don't throw any rotten potatoes for what I'm going to say. Zimbabwe has just had its elections. Both the African Union and SADC and other observer missions that were there, including the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, all of them have said that these elections credibly represent the view of the people of Zimbabwe. As you know, one of the losing parties, the MDCT, has contested that assessment. And they decided to go to court to challenge that outcome. And personally, I was very happy indeed that they did that they went to court, because at last this would provide an opportunity to give the detail of what it is that went wrong, if anything, what it is that went wrong with the Zimbabwe elections, as a consequence of which you then make the charge that the elections were fraudulent. So I applauded. I said, very well done, good decision. And I was very disappointed that the case was withdrawn. Before it was heard, I was asking myself, but why withdraw this case? When you seem so confident about your facts. The British High Commissioner in Zimbabwe, during the elections, made a statement, was interviewed by a television network. And she said there was a constituency in Zimbabwe where 17,000 people voted, of whom 10,000 were assisted to vote within the polling station. Now this is allowed. For instance, you might be blind, you are illiterate, or whatever. You can ask the officials within the polling station to say, my favorite candidate is Mzwandile Mono. Please put a cross next to his name. It's allowed. But what was strange about this, that you would have so many people, out of 17,000, 10,000 would need assistance. It looked very strange. And so indeed, Her Excellency, the High Commissioner, the Ambassador, was asked to identify this constituency where this took place. And she has it up to today. But strangely, this story appeared in the court documents that the MDCT submitted to court. There was a constituency in Zimbabwe, 17,000 voters, 10,000 assistants. They also don't say where this constituency was. And so when the case gets withdrawn, it's not difficult to come to the conclusion that perhaps it became impossible to prove that there was such a constituency, that such a thing did happen. But I'm saying that the whole continent, the whole African continent, SADC Lawyers Association, the SADC itself, all sorts of observers, said these elections credibly represent the view of the people of Zimbabwe. But there are people who are sitting in Washington across the Atlantic who say we know better than these Africans do. The Africans are wrong. The elections in Zimbabwe were fraudulent, and therefore we'll continue our sanctions against them. And all of us, the whole continent, represented by all its institutions, governmental and non-governmental, the entire continent was wrong, and the United States is right. I think it exemplifies exactly this point, that what Professor Nkusi was talking about, that something has changed, that there has redeveloped in the mind of many in the world a notion that the Africans are in fact less human than they are. And therefore that even our continent here is there for the taking. That is something we've got to contest, so that we do not have more Libyans. We don't have a situation where somebody from far away will decide that I don't like this government, I don't like the other one, and therefore I'll act. The last thing I should mention in this context is Kenya again. You know that the current president of Kenya and the vice president have been charged with all sorts of offenses and have to appear before the International Criminal Court. This became an issue during the elections. You had again people from the Western world saying to the voters of Kenya, please be careful how you vote, because your vote will have consequences. This is the word they used. In other words, they were saying to the Kenyans, don't vote for Uhuru Kenyatta, don't vote for William Ruto, because those people have been charged and are supposed to appear before the International Criminal Court. It's clear that the Kenyan population did not like that message, and took a decision that the issue about who was going to govern Kenya was entirely a prerogative of the Kenyan people. And so they elected Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto. Since then, the African Union has approached the International Criminal Court to say to them that the International Criminal Court is not, even in terms of the Rome Statute, is not a court of first resort. It intervenes in the instances that countries are not able or not willing to prosecute offenses like crimes against humanity and so on. And so the African Union said to the ICC that Kenya has got the institutions, has got the judicial institutions to try these cases, and is willing to do so. And therefore that these cases of the President and Vice President of Kenya should be referred back to the Kenyan courts to be tried. The International Criminal Court has responded, has given a legal response to this, effectively to say, we are not going to refer these cases back to the Kenyan courts. And so what is happening is that in a few days' time, perhaps in a week's time, a bit more, there will be a summit meeting of the African Union on this matter. Because you know that the Parliament of Kenya has already decided that Kenya should withdraw from the ICC, from the Rome Statute. And this is why the whole continent is now discussing. So there will be a summit meeting of the African Union in another 10 days or so, discussing this particular matter, of what the African continent should do, what its stance should be towards the International Criminal Court. Because indeed, apart from what has just happened with regard to the Kenyan situation, a long time ago, the African Union asked the Security Council to use its powers to suspend the warrant that had been issued for the arrest of President Bashir of Sudan, on the basis that President Bashir is an important player with regard to securing peace for the people of Sudan. Not to cancel the warrant, but to defer its implementation. And Security Council has refused. And yet, if you talk to the Sudanese, I'm talking particularly about the South Sudanese, who were at war with the North for 40 years. If you talk to the South Sudanese today, they will say, we don't want President Bashir to go anywhere. Because without him, we are not going to have the peace that we need. But I'm saying some people sitting somewhere else don't hear that African voice. In the end, if we allow that to happen, we will have more Libyans. We will have more interventions which are contrary to these dreams and values and opportunities which Reverend Mono was talking about. So, hopefully by the time we part this evening, all of us will have taken this decision that we want to be these change agents. To make sure that we reconstruct our continent in terms of the vision it has set itself. With regard to all of these things I'm talking about, its politics, matters of peace and security, issues of the economy, eradication of poverty, role of women, and so on, that hopefully by the time we part this evening, we will have expanded this army of activists for the transformation of our continent, for the better.